The sky deepened into shades of gray as a gentle drizzle enveloped the narrow street where Kwon resided. At 25, he was a mechanic who had experienced the loss of his mother early in life and now resided with his delicate father. Kwon's life was fraught with challenges, burdened by the substantial debt his father left in the wake of numerous unsuccessful ventures. The modest auto repair shop he established barely provided for the father and son, yet it fell short of settling the substantial debt they faced. Once, Kwon dreamed of leaving his hometown for the city in search of a better life, yet the thought of abandoning his ailing father weighed heavily on his heart. Deep within him, a singular desire burned, to settle every debt and provide his father with a life of comfort. 1. On a rainy day, as Kwon diligently worked on fixing an old car, an unexpected call came through from an unknown number. On the other end of the line was the voice of a resilient elderly woman, filled with strength. "Kwon, I am Mrs. Then. I have a significant matter to bring to your attention. Gather." At 7 p.m., I found myself at Min Chow coffee shop. This evening. Kwon was taken aback. This name was completely unfamiliar to him. What was her connection to him? And perhaps most crucially, what was her motivation for wanting to meet him? Despite his initial hesitation, curiosity compelled Kwon to venture to the coffee shop. Upon his arrival, he found himself taken aback. Before him stood a woman of 74 years. Her hair was neatly tied back, framing a face marked by the rugged features of someone accustomed to the demands of the corporate realm. She donned a graceful gown, complemented by understated yet opulent accessories. Mrs. then regarded Kwon, offered a subtle smile, and proceeded directly to the matter at hand. "Are you considering settling your father's debt? Are you ready to transform your life?" Kwon furrowed his brow, uncertainty creeping into his heart. What led her to be aware of his circumstances? What was it to her? Who was she, really? How was she aware of my existence? Kwon spoke slowly, yet with a clear sense of caution. Mrs. then delicately savored her tea, her gaze shimmering with intrigue. "I have my methods. The key point is that I can assist you in overcoming your debt, but there is one condition you must agree to." Kwon tightened his grip, a nagging feeling in his gut suggesting that all was not as it should be. "What conditions?" he inquired, his voice laced with careful apprehension. Mrs. then gazed directly into Kwon's eyes, articulating each word with deliberate slowness. "I would like you to enter into a marriage with me, solely for legal purposes. I require a legally recognized spouse." Kwon was taken aback, nearly letting his coffee cup slip from his grasp. "Are you serious? I'm just young enough to be your grandchild." Yet Mrs. then maintained her composure. "I'm serious. I seek a youthful, single partner, and you stand out as the ideal option. I require neither affection nor concern. I simply require a formal union to fulfill a personal aspiration. All you have to do is be my partner in life. In name, just stay with me until my last breath. In exchange, I will settle your father's debt. Look after what lies ahead. Upon my passing, all that I own will be yours." The proposal was quite peculiar. Kwon was not a man driven by greed, yet he understood that this was his sole opportunity to liberate his father from the burdens of debt. Yet, there lingered an element in Mrs. Then's words that he found difficult to fully believe. After a night of contemplation, Kwon remained uncertain. Was this merely a legal union, or was there something deeper lurking beneath the surface? The questions echoed relentlessly in his mind. What led Mrs. Then to select him? Was her desire for a legal marriage genuine, or did it stem from something deeper? Contemplating his father's plight, burdened by the weight of debt, Kwon found himself with no alternative. On the following morning, he reached for the phone and dialed Mrs. Then. "Do you really intend to settle all the debts for my father and me?" On the other end of the line, Mrs. Then maintained a steady voice, unwavering and composed. "I always keep my word. Once we sign the marriage certificate, all your debts will vanish. I find myself concerned about what lies ahead for you." Those words wield a captivating yet daunting power. At last, the soldier clenched his jaw and endeavored to push aside the uncertainties that plagued his mind. "All right, I've come to an agreement." Several days later, an unusual wedding unfolded in the vicinity. It was not a lavish celebration, nor a bustling assembly of family, rather, it was a modest affair held at Mrs. Dent's villa. The gathering consisted solely of her trusted confidants, a handful of military acquaintances, and a few housekeepers. Once the word of this union circulated, the village erupted into a flurry of chatter. "The man who wed Mrs. Dent is incredibly wealthy, it surely stems from his financial success. She has crossed the threshold of 70, while he is merely 25. This feels quite unusual. He must have consented to the marriage to settle his debts. The burden of his father's debt." Whispers and speculation appeared to be omnipresent. Some chuckled, some felt sympathy, yet the army paid no heed to any of them. For him, this wedding was not a celebration of love, but rather a transaction. He traded his freedom to rescue his father. Once the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Mrs. Dent turned to Kwon, offering him a smile that held a deeper significance. There was no need for him to express his dissatisfaction. "Simply reside here, and you will grasp my genuine intention." This sentence left Kwon feeling unsettled. Despite having embraced this union, he remained unable to shake the burgeoning sense of insecurity that was taking root within his heart. The following morning, Kwon officially took up residence in Mrs. Dent's villa. From a modest, worn-down dwelling in a struggling area, he now stepped into a grand, beautifully decorated residence, reminiscent of a cinematic scene. His initial emotion was not one of enthusiasm, but rather a sense of opposition. The villa was vast, yet it exuded an eerie silence, devoid of the cheerful laughter of a family, lacking the lively energy typical of a home. Kwon observed that the villa housed merely 3 servants, yet they maintained an extraordinary silence. They emerged solely when tasks were completed, and then silently faded away. Mrs. Dent displayed no warmth whatsoever. Despite their legal union, she maintained an unmistakable sense of distance. They encountered each other solely during mealtimes, as Mrs. Dent dedicated the majority of her hours to her office or to places her husband was unaware of. One evening, as they shared a meal, Kwon felt compelled to voice his thoughts. "Mrs. Dent, what is the reason for the scarcity of people in this house? Do you not have any kids or grandkids?" Mrs. Dent set her chopsticks aside on the table and fixed Kwon with a piercing gaze. "I reside by myself. All my family members have departed. All that's required is for you to fulfill your role. Try not to stress too much." The response sent a slight chill down Kwon's spine. She mentioned that all the family members had departed. Was it merely a coincidence, or was there something she had been concealing for 3 days? Following the wedding, as Kwon was awkwardly navigating the living room, Mrs. Dent unexpectedly summoned him to her office. A hefty pile of papers lay on the table. "Sign here," she commanded with a firm tone. Kwon gathered the papers and examined them closely. The document pertained to real estate matters and certain financial obligations. In that instant, he sensed that something was amiss. "Hold on, what is this? What relevance does it hold for me?" Mrs. Dent responded with a serene demeanor. "No need to be concerned. It's merely about granting legal status to all things. It has been a situation from the start." "Did you overlook Kwon Tran-Tru's inquiry?" Though he lacked legal expertise, signing a document without thoroughly reviewing it was a perilous move. Yet, as he raised his gaze, he realized her eyes held an icy chill like never before. It felt like she was putting him to the test. It felt as though declining would lead to severe repercussions. The atmosphere was thick with an overwhelming sense of constriction. Kwon let out a weary breath. At last, he affixed his signature, oblivious to the fact that he had unwittingly walked into an enormous snare. Kwon sat quietly in his bedroom, gripping the pen tightly, his heart racing. He had just affixed his signature to the documents presented by Mrs. Dent, yet an unsettling feeling lingered within him. He sensed that he had just bartered away his very essence to a dark force. The expansive villa remained hauntingly quiet. The clock on the window ticked away as the sky loomed overhead, an expanse of pitch-black darkness. A chilling breeze swept through the room, causing him to tremble. The following morning, as the soldiers made their way to the dining room, they found Mrs. Then seated there, savoring a cup of tea at a leisurely pace. The air between them remained as frigid as ever, yet today Mrs. Then decided to break the silence. The papers have been signed. You are now an integral part of this journey. Relish it. Kwon gazed at her, taken aback. What was her intention behind that? Mrs. Then offered a slight smile, hesitating before responding as she placed the teacup gently on the table. Her gaze locked onto him with profound significance. Have you ever pondered why I selected you from among countless others? What made me desire you as my partner for life? The question unexpectedly stirred a sense of discomfort within Kwon. Wasn't she simply seeking companionship? He inquired once more. Indeed, but not completely. Her words flowed with a serene demeanor, yet carried an icy edge. Kwon experienced a shiver creeping along his spine. Mrs. Then pressed on. His father was once a remarkable individual, yet he was also someone who inflicted considerable pain on others. Were you aware that his father? Kwon was taken aback. What was she expressing? Despite the failure of his business, my father never caused harm to anyone. Mrs. Then offered a faint smile, yet her gaze was piercing and intense. In that case, you're not aware of the complete reality. Following that statement, she rose from her seat and departed from the table, leaving Kwon with a multitude of questions swirling in his mind. Overwhelmed by a sense of unease that evening, Kwon resolved to confide in the loyal maid who had been with them for years. Inside the dwelling, he approached Mrs. Lon, a woman of middle age, who appeared soft-spoken and serene. Mrs. Lon, may I inquire about something? Mrs. Lon paused briefly, yet ultimately gave a nod of agreement. Proceed. What accounts for the scarcity of individuals in this villa? Are you familiar with Mrs. Then's history? Mrs. Lon regarded him with a peculiar expression, weighing her decision to speak or remain silent. Following a brief pause, she let out a deep sigh. You are the spouse of the landlady. It may not have been the best choice of words, but I strongly suggest you consider leaving this place if possible. Why? Mrs. Lon glanced around as if fearful of being overheard, then whispered, Did you know the landlady once had a joyful family, but then it all vanished? Her husband passed away under enigmatic circumstances, her son vanished without a trace, and everyone who once held a position here seemed to leave before long. Kwon sensed a tightness in his chest. What was her intention? They vanished. Mrs. Lon nodded, her voice growing gentler. I'm at a loss as well. It seems that everyone who becomes a part of her story meets an unfortunate fate. The words lingered in Kwon's mind, preventing sleep that night. He started to doubt his own thoughts. Who was she? Is that so? What was her reason for wanting to marry him? He could no longer endure it. The following day, Kwon resolved to uncover what Mrs. Then had mentioned regarding his father. He made his way back to his hometown and encountered those who had known his father. After numerous inquiries, an old acquaintance of his father's, Mr. Huang, ultimately consented to share all the details with him. His father possessed great intelligence, yet he also committed numerous significant errors. What errors? Mr. Huang sighed. Long ago, his father entered into a business partnership with a wealthy woman named Mrs. Then. Kwon was taken aback. At that time, Mrs. Then still had both a husband and a son. Together, they poured their resources into a significant endeavor. Yet, in a twist of fate, his father shattered their trust. Unthinkable. Kwon shook his head in disbelief. What actions did he take? He betrayed Mrs. Then, leading to her losing everything she owned. The shock led to her husband's tragic decision to take his own life, while her son vanished without a trace. Kwon felt his heart racing. The words he had just heard struck him like a thunderclap, reverberating through his thoughts. She took the plunge into marriage as an act of vengeance. Mr. Huang regarded him with a gaze full of compassion. Perhaps he ought to exercise caution. As he made his way back to the villa, a wave of awareness washed over him, making him acutely conscious of his surroundings. He has become frightening. He recalled the documents that Mrs. Then had him sign. Without hesitation, he dashed into her office and sifted through the papers. At last, he uncovered the contracts he had signed, and a chilling revelation unfolded before him. The documents in question encompassed not just Mrs. Then's assets, but also the substantial debt attributed to him. "Oh, my goodness! What is this all about?" Quan declared with enthusiasm. At that moment, Mrs. Then's voice echoed behind him. Did he discover the truth? Quan spun around, his heart racing. Mrs. Then stood there, her eyes transformed from gentle to cold and intimidating. What did she do to me? Mrs. Then moved in closer, her smile carrying a deeper significance. I accomplished nothing. Now, he has officially taken on the burden of his father's debt. Was she seeking retribution? What was his opinion? Quan sensed his entire reality crumbling right in front of him. He found himself ensnared in an exquisite trap, one that had been meticulously crafted over the span of more than 30 years. Quan sensed the ground giving way beneath him, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. He gazed at the documents pinned to the board, the very ones he had signed, oblivious to the fact that they were the snare Mrs. Then had meticulously crafted long before. He tightened his fists, his voice quaking with rage. She deceived me. Mrs. Then composedly settled into the chair, savored a sip of tea, and regarded him with an icy gaze. I assure you, I was truthful with you. I was explicit from the outset. You consented to it yourself, signed all those documents without reviewing them. I didn't compel you. Quan experienced a pervasive chill throughout his body. Indeed, he had affixed his signature without a glance at the contents. He had willingly stepped into her snare. Quan clenched his jaw and gathered his resolve to pose the question. Was all of this merely an act of vengeance against my father? You entered into this marriage solely to ensure I endure the repercussions. With a faint smile, Mrs. Then set her teacup gently on the table for him. I want you to not only feel my experiences but also grasp the significance of losing an eye, the weight of betrayal, and the despair of being trapped with no one to turn to for support. Your father assured my husband and me that he would collaborate in business, yet he subsequently destroyed all of my family's resources, leaving us without a dime. My husband took his own life in a moment of rage, and my son has departed the country, leaving me without any word from him. I transitioned from a woman who possessed it all to abruptly facing the loss of everything. Mrs. Then squinted, her voice a hushed whisper laced with bitterness. I have carried that resentment for over 30 years, and now I wish for your father to release that burden through his only son. Those words pierced the soldier's heart like a blade. He tightened his grip, fingers curling into hard knots. It became clear that he was merely a tool in this quest for vengeance. Quan quivered as he glanced at the documents spread across the table. He scrutinized every line, and a wave of despair surged within him. The debt totaled billions of dong. He found himself at a loss for words. Madam, are you truly going to burden me with all this debt? She gave a slight shrug. I didn't compel you to do anything. It's clearly stated in the document you signed. At this point, the responsibility lies solely with you. Quan sank into his seat, overwhelmed by a sense of hopelessness. He recalled the times of hardship. He recalled his aspiration to transform his existence. Recall the optimism that filled you when you put pen to paper. This union. And now it feels like a haunting dream. You may seize everything I own, but I refuse to allow you to destroy my existence. The military presence was imminent. Mrs. Then chuckled softly. Do you really believe I have any interest in your property? All my desires are fulfilled. Now I can only watch as you endure the same pain I once faced. I feel content. That sentence drove Quan to the brink of madness. He realized he couldn't go on in this manner. He had to discover an escape from this predicament. Under the cover of darkness, Kwon slipped away from the villa. He couldn't merely remain idle and await his own demise. He needed to uncover a method to demonstrate that Mrs. Then had wrongfully orchestrated his downfall. The crucial issue was the legality of the documents he had signed. He recalled Won, a friend of his who was pursuing a law degree. In this situation, Won was undoubtedly the one who could assist him in locating the rightful owner. Kwon promptly made his way to Won's law office. Won's brow furrowed as he shared all the details, his words deliberate and measured. "It seems you truly walked right into her snare. Before we proceed, can you recall anything out of the ordinary regarding the documents you signed?" Kwon paused in contemplation, then a sudden realization struck him. Indeed. Certain documents exhibited indications of modification. Upon signing, there were terms that were completely overlooked. Won acknowledged with a nod. "That's the essential takeaway. If you possess evidence that she altered the document's contents post-signature, you have grounds to pursue legal action against her for fraud." "But how can I find the proof?" Won pondered for a moment before suggesting, "Could you check the surveillance cameras in the villa? If a recording exists of the moment you signed the document, we can juxtapose it with the present content." Kwon realized that this was his sole opportunity to rescue Lee on his own. That evening, he made his way back to the villa. Silence enveloped the house. Kwon slipped into Ms. Tan's office, where the computer system held the camera data. His hands trembled as he opened it, his heart racing. He possessed a singular opportunity to secure the proof. After some time spent searching, he discovered a video recording of himself signing the documents. As he clicked play, the chilling reality unfolded right before him. Once the soldier completed the paperwork, Mrs. Tan discreetly produced another set of documents to substitute for the one he had just signed. It was she who had taken the papers. Kwon was utterly astonished by what he saw. His hand clutched the mouse with intensity, his heart racing in his chest. At that moment, a chilling voice echoed from behind him. "I anticipated you would take this action." Pants were yanked abruptly. Mrs. Tan lingered at the entrance, her gaze icy, her features devoid of emotion. He endeavored to maintain his composure, his tone resolute. "She had deceived me. The proof is right in my grasp. This truth is inescapable." Mrs. Tan gazed at him intently for an extended moment. She chuckled softly. "Do you really believe you can dismiss me so effortlessly?" Those words compelled Kwon to express himself. Mrs. Tan exhibited no fear whatsoever. In fact, it appeared as though she had been readying herself for this moment for quite some time. Kwon started to understand that the story was far from finished here. This marked just the onset of an intense clash. The air in Mrs. Tan's office grew heavy and ominous. Kwon remained motionless, his gaze locked onto the computer screen, where the footage of Mrs. Tan handing over the documents, immediately after he had signed, played out before him. Mrs. Tan loomed behind him, her gaze sharp and discerning. "Do you believe this video has the power to change the situation?" Her voice was steady, yet an unmistakable menace lingered beneath the surface. She fastened her pants with a shaky breath, striving to maintain her composure. "Given the undeniable proof, do you really believe I will allow it to pass, regardless of your decision? Whether you choose me or not is entirely your decision, but keep in mind that you are in my domain." Mrs. Tan let out a soft laugh. "I was utilized by the army." Indeed. This remained her sanctuary, while he found himself in solitude. He had to depart without delay. "Grab this video now before the opportunity slips away." Kwon swiftly yanked the USB from the computer. Just as he was on the verge of spinning around to flee, a sudden bang echoed through the air. A firm grip tightened around his arm. It was Mrs. Tan. She embraced him firmly. Her gaze radiated strength. "I recommend you avoid making unwise choices. Should you leave this place with that video, I assure you it won't end well. Find a way to break free once more." Quan tightened his fists, struggling to push himself free. She was powerless to stop me, yet just then, a figure emerged at the door. It was the two bodyguards of Mrs. Tan. Quan was taken aback. He was taken aback by how thoroughly she had everything prepared. "Hold him back," Mrs. Tan commanded. The two bodyguards hurried toward him. There simply was no alternative. Quan rose to his feet, brushed off Mrs. Tan's hand, and dashed directly to the window. He bolted from the room, leaped over the second-floor balcony, and landed on the grass below. His head throbbed with unbearable agony, yet he pressed on relentlessly. Mrs. Tan's voice rang out behind him, instantly grabbing his attention. Two bodyguards hurried down the stairs in pursuit of him. Quan dashed eagerly toward the villa gate, just a short distance ahead. A powerful blast struck him on the shoulder. Quan stumbled and tumbled to the earth. One of the two bodyguards closed the distance, seized his collar, and yanked him back. "Do you believe there's a way out of this place?" The sentinel was close by. Quan fought to break free, but just then, a voice echoed, resonating with everyone present. Quan glanced up to see Wan, his attorney friend, positioned just outside the villa gate, accompanied by the police. Mrs. Tan emerged at the second-floor desk, gazing down at the police, her expression reflecting a sense of bewilderment. A police officer advanced, displaying his badge with authority. "Ms. Tan, we are here with a warrant to conduct a search of your villa, as we have obtained evidence regarding your fraudulent activities and deceitful actions." Mrs. Tan's complexion drained of color. Wan approached Quan and offered him a hand to rise. "I was certain she would stay. I called the police before you arrived, and they discovered fake documents in her financial records." Quan felt a surge of joy, yet a sense of disbelief lingered within him. He cast a glance at the officers. "Is she going to be taken into custody?" The officer gave a slight nod. The proof was unmistakable. There was not just deception in the marriage contract, there were also indications of financial misconduct. "We will delve deeper into this matter." Mrs. Tan perched on the work desk, her hands firmly clutching the railing. "This isn't something you can impose on me. I dedicated my entire life to creating this enterprise. No one is entitled to strip it from me." A policeman stepped forward and stated with a chilling tone, "She constructed it through deception." Now it was her moment to settle the score. Mrs. Tan's complexion drained of color. At last, clarity dawned upon her. She had been defeated. Two officers stepped into the villa, secured Ms. Tan with handcuffs, and escorted her out. Quan remained motionless, observing intently. A peculiar sensation stirred within his heart. He felt a sense of neutrality, devoid of both elation and happiness. He discovered only a void. Following Mrs. Tan's arrest, Quan faced a challenging period. He needed to demonstrate his complete disassociation from her dubious activities and devise a strategy to resolve the debts that had been incurred. With the assistance of Luan and the authorities, he was exonerated. The documents that were signed unlawfully have been annulled. Yet, what weighed heavily on Quan's mind was Mrs. Tan. He found it impossible to harbor complete hatred for her, as she had been a tragic figure, misled, wronged, driven to her breaking point. Had her life not been marked by so much suffering, she might not have transformed into the person she is today. Quan chose to release any lingering resentments within himself. He yearned for a fresh start, free from the shackles of greed. He returned to academia and earned his law degree. He had moved past the desire to amass wealth through easy means. He aspired to be someone of value, a person who truly cherished existence. A year later, as the dust settled, Quan found himself holding a letter from prison. It came from Mrs. Tan. In the letter, her tone had shifted, no longer carrying the chill or bitterness it once did. Only one sentence existed that diverged from your father's experience. Quan lingered over the letter in silence for an extended moment. At last, he carefully folded it and tucked it away in his pocket. He understood that this was the final moment he would encounter Mrs. Tan. He emerged from the house into the warm embrace of the morning sunlight, then carried on with his walk. The tale of Quan and Mrs. Tan unfolds as a strategic union, yet it also serves as a deep exploration of avarice and animosity, ultimately guiding us toward the journey of forgiveness. The central theme of this narrative is that wealth cannot purchase true joy, and that animosity only leads to greater suffering. Even with all the assets at your disposal, if your heart is consumed by hatred, you will remain shrouded in darkness for eternity. Do not allow the errors of others to dictate the course of your existence. Quan had the option to remain consumed by hatred, yet he chose to release it and embark on a new beginning. His compassion and unwavering determination led him to discover the genuine essence of existence. Forgiveness embodies strength, it is a pathway to freedom. Mrs. Tan discovered genuine tranquility only when she realized that seeking revenge did not lead to peace, but rather caused her to lose her own essence. Every individual possesses the freedom to select their own journey. One cannot select the circumstances of their birth, yet each individual possesses the freedom to determine the course of their life. Live with integrity, show compassion, and continue to pursue your goals, for this existence is not solely about what we gain, but also the principles we impart. If this tale resonates with you, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to the channel Netdep Tamhan, ensuring you stay updated with the next impactful narratives. Let us share compassionate teachings, ensuring that with each passing day, we evolve into improved versions of ourselves. Thank you for your support, and I look forward to sharing more tales with you soon.